So before we start reading 1 Samuel 14, I just want to give some context before, because it kind of jumps in the middle of a story here. So basically, Saul has been made king and is a few years into his reign. And just before we read it, Jonathan had gone out and attacked one of the Philistine outposts. The Philistines responded by sending out their army. And then Saul counters and tries to unite all of Israel together to fight against them. However, then when the Israelites kind of saw how large and well-equipped the enemy army was, they began to become very afraid. And chapter 13, verse 7, it says that they began to quake in fear. And from this fear, a lot of the Israelites then went away and hid in caves and the thickets among the local landscapes. So they were hiding away from the army. And in the meantime, Saul is waiting for Samuel to come and offer burnt offering to seek the Lord's favor. However, Samuel is late, and then the men begin to scatter. So Saul tries to take matters into his own hands and offers up burnt sacrifices, which then Samuel shows up just as he's starting to finish up. And Samuel then rebukes Saul, and this is where then kind of the downfall of Saul starts happening. And Samuel informs him that the kingdom will not follow his family line, and that God is going to appoint someone else that is after God's own heart. And after Samuel leaves, the number of men that the Israelites had went from 3,000 to 600, compared to the Philistine army, which had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and it says soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And that's all found in chapter 13. And furthermore, the Philistines also had a monopoly on all the blacksmiths in the area, and none of the Israelites had swords except for Jonathan and Saul, because the Philistines obviously didn't want their enemies having weapons, which makes complete sense. But the rest of Israel would have probably been fighting with bows and slings, whereas the Philistines' army are very well equipped compared. And basically, in summary, essentially, the Israelites are vastly outnumbered and a massive technological disadvantage. So, without further ado, we can start reading through 1 Samuel 14, 1 through 15. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, 3, including Eliha, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other, Sinha. The one crag rose on the north in the front of the Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Gibeah. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of those uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." And his armor bearer said to him, "Do that is all in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they said it to us, 'Wait until we come up to you,' then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be a sign to us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his own hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within, as they were half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the fields, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. So kind of just trying to focus in on each verse here. In verse 1, one day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. And from the first verse, we start to see the faith that Jonathan really has. 'Cause remember, with the context, the rest of the Israelites are quaking in fear, and a lot of them are trying to hide away from everything and anyone because they're afraid of what might happen. Whereas Jonathan is on the complete other side, where he wasn't fearful because he was remembering what God had done for him, and that he remembered and knew that at the end of the day, the battle isn't won by their own weapons or their own flesh, but by God. And he knew that God would be able to deliver them victory over the Philistines. And just the amount of faith that Jonathan must have, it's just him and his armor bearer, two people to go over with opposing armies, where the army is at least 6,000 people plus. And the soldiers are as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That is a large amount. That is quite a few people. And this is really just a massive step to take. And I feel like when we read this, at first glance, we'll probably look at this and say, this guy is kind of stupid. There's a difference between bravery and stupid, and that's kind of not the wisest decision to make, right? However, I think Jonathan might have had a verse going through his mind during this time. Joshua 23, verse 10. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. And the important thing to remember is that the Israelites were not alone, but God was with them. And Jonathan here is just really remembering that all the battles throughout Israel's history, they weren't won because of the Israelites' strength. They were won because of God. And as the Israelites were first going in to inherit the promised land during the conquest of Joshua's time, they're only allowed to conquer a certain amount, right? So throughout the time of the kings, especially David, they tried to fully conquer the rest of the land that God had promised to them. So not only is Jonathan just remembering of the acts of how God has helped them in the previous battles and wars they had, but he's also remembering that God has promised them this land, and that God is someone who fulfills every promise he makes. So it's not just that Jonathan is kind of, quoting Philippians 4:13 and be like, oh, we can do anything because God says we can, right? It's rooted on God's promise to Israel, and rooted on the fact that he knows that God can move in ways that we might never think of in the moment. Before moving on to the next verse, it's also kind of interesting to note that Jonathan didn't tell his father, who's also the king, which kind of leads to the question, why didn't he tell his father? After all, isn't it kind of wise to try to tell your parents some of the stuff you're doing, to try to get wisdom or anything like that? And I think if the pretty self-explanatory answer is the reason he didn't is because Saul probably would have told him not to, right? And maybe that's a lot of the reason kids don't tell their parents, but I think in this instance, Jonathan made the right decision, because throughout the previous chapters, we begin to see Saul's spiritual condition and his lack of faith. Whereas Jonathan in this instant was really stirred up by his faith. He was prompted by his faith. And the Lord kind of called him. So he began to take those next steps of faith. And just again, the acts of faith, the steps he'd taken wasn't just based on his own ignorant mindset of wanting to try to get victory. It was to try to fulfill God's promise and let God use him in those ways. Then reading verse 2 and 3, Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, 3 including Eliha, the son of Ethub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. And really we see the stark contrast between Jonathan and Saul here. Jonathan was looking around and noticed that all the men were quaking with fear and went and hid. And Jonathan was remembering the past acts and promises of God, and then began to try to work on a solution to the problem and letting God lead him. Whereas Saul is seemingly sitting around, waiting for something or someone to come along with like a solution or a plan. It doesn't seem like he was actively doing anything to try to help the situation. And Saul might have had the appearance to all those around him that he was trying to work on something, as he had a priest there with the ephod, which was what the high priest would wear, and attached to it was like the Urim and Thummim, which were used to cast lots, kind of in order to seek God's will, right? So we even see that Saul has the tools in order to seek God's will, but we clearly see that he chose not to use them at all, or not to try to seek God's will. The only time he begins to start using them is way later on in chapter 14, after the battle has already begun and God has already started to cause the enemy camp into chaos. And Saul's faith is very based on sight rather than trust, whereas Jonathan's is rooted in trust. Another interesting thing about verse 2 and 3 here is the fact that the name Ichabod is mentioned. Because the name Ichabod means without glory. And Ichabod was named by Eli's daughter-in-law after Eli and then his two sons had died, and also then when the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines in the previous chapters. And throughout the Bible, like usually uncles aren't mentioned when giving like a brief summary of a person's lineage, which makes it really interesting as to why the name Ichabod appears in this passage. And I think a good reason that it appears is to play a very key role as like a literary tool to really just display Saul's spiritual condition. Because if we remember, this is after Samuel has told Saul that God is going to replace him as king, and that his family lineage won't continue on for the throne, and that he will be replaced with a man after God's own heart. And Saul has really been disobeying God and has lost the right to be king over God's people. And Saul has stopped reflecting God's glory and has thus lost glory. And if we read John 15, verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And really, I think this is where we see that Saul is not connected to God. And from that disconnect from God, he lost the sharing in God's glory. And we see that his spiritual condition is very poor in that he hasn't sought God's will or counsel and is really living apart from God, which I think is a key reason why that name is mentioned there. And then moving along, verses 4 and 5. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other, Sinha. The one crag rose on the north in the front of Mihash, and the other on the south in front of Gibeah. And I have a picture of a potential spot of where that little pass could have been. And if you look there, imagine trying to climb up that with armor and swords going to like an enemy outpost there. Like that would not have been an easy climb or walk to do at all. Like if anyone has kind of done any like sort of mountain climbing or anything like that, it's exhausting. Like making those climbs up is not easy at all. And moving along to verses 6 through 7, Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord for saving by many or by few." And his armor-bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." And this is where we see how Jonathan's faith is very much in action and how he's actively taking those steps of faith. He's saying that nothing can hinder the Lord. He understands that his God is bigger than all others. God has the power over everything and controls everything. He knows that the victory is not based on their simply fighting abilities or size of their army, but it's all based on God's power and his will. And that God, again, can use many people, few people, or no people for his will to come through. One will rout 1,000. The other part two to this is we're focusing on Jonathan, but his armor bearer must have also had a very strong faith as well. And the fact that he doesn't even seem to question what Jonathan is doing. It's the complete opposite. He's basically saying, yeah, if you're thinking and you feel that that's what we need to do, well, then I'm with you. Like, how many of us, if a close friend of ours said, hey, I'm going over to this opposing enemy with 1,000 people, like, you think we should do it? I'd be like, no. But he also has a strong faith, and I think he sees Jonathan's face and that he's being led by God. And then he equally has a faith in God. And I think just that section there, that do that as all in your heart, do as you wish, behold, I am with you, heart and soul, really is reminded as a verse that's repeated throughout the Bible, but Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And we really see that Jonathan and his armor bearer are very actively living out this verse. They're loving their God and actively seeking his will for them and God's people. They're putting everything they have on the line in order to do it. If we move along to verses 8 through 10. Then Jonathan said, behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign for us. So before Jonathan and his armor bearer cross over the gap to the Philistines, Jonathan posed a question to God. He asked for a sign from God, which begs kind of like the age-old question, is it okay to ask for signs from God? Because there's other examples throughout the Bible where people ask for signs from God, and it's commonly thought to be testing God. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 16, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And one of the prime examples of someone asking for a sign from God, and it being said as testing God, is the story of Gideon, right? As Gideon was asked by an angel sent from God to lead the Israelites out of the Midianites' oppression. And then he asked for a sign from God to confirm that God would deliver them into their hands. So he set out a fleece and asked God to let only the fleece have dew in the morning. And then morning came, and the fleece was wet, and the ground around it was dry. Then Gideon asked the Lord again if he could make the ground around the fleece wet, but keep the fleece dry. And the next morning Gideon woke up to find that the ground was wet with dew, and the fleece was dry. And throughout the story of Gideon, God clearly says to Gideon that he is to lead his people out of oppression. However, even after those calls, he keeps asking God for signs. And Gideon was asking signs almost out of a lack from faith. He wasn't sure if God was actually going to lead his people out, or if he kind of could, right? Whereas in this situation, we look at Jonathan and the armor bearer. They aren't asking for a sign from God out of a lack of faith, but rather out of clarity and direction. They were asking for clarity if that is what God would have them do. Whereas Gideon was asking God to show him that he is God. Whereas Gideon had a lack of faith. And I think we've talked a lot about faith, but really, what is faith? And really, what is the foundation of faith? And throughout last week, I was reading Psalm 105 in my study Bible. And it talks about like remembering the acts of God. And what I try to do when I'm reading my Bible is I try to read kind of the study notes along with it, because I just find it helps me better understand it, and kind of just makes it more relevant to me. And the one note it had on that verse about remembering the acts of God is that remembering is the basis for faith. Remembering is the basis for faith. And really, one common misconception about Christians is sometimes we're seen to have a quote-unquote blind faith, right? Because many people will look at faith and think it's silly or foolish to have faith even, as you're just blindly trusting something or someone. I mean, in some cases, they're completely right. Having faith in things or people is foolish. If your faith is misplaced, it will leave you hurt and broken. However, as Christians, we do not have a blind or misplaced faith. We have an entire book that shows how God has been faithful throughout all generations. and how he will continue to remain faithful to the end. And when we look at Jonathan in this story, we can clearly see that he's actively remembering those acts of God. His faith is rooted in those remembering of the acts of God. He's remembering how he led his people out of Egypt, and then how he's with them through the conquest of Canaan, the conquest of the promised land. And his faith wasn't a blind faith of just, let's go and do this for the sake of it. It was based on the works and acts of God. He knows that God can deliver his people with horrendous odds, and that he's done it before, and that God can do it again. And I think a big part of that faith, especially in this case, is that he was okay with not knowing the whole plan before he began to start in those steps of faith. And this is where, again, it wasn't wrong for Jonathan to ask for God's direction or ask for a sign to confirm that that's what God wanted him to do. As in, he was really, in this story, was simply seeking what the next step was. He's not asking God how everything's going to work out. He's simply asking God to direct him in how he is to go forward. And a quote I found on this passage while I was doing some research on it by David Guzik, and I think it kind of summarizes it very well. Jonathan was prompted by faith. Significantly, he did not demand to know the whole battle plan from God in advance. He was willing to take it one step at a time and let God plan it out. Faith is willing to let God know the whole plan and to know our part one step at a time. Faith is having confidence that God is directing us in the best ways. Even when we may not necessarily see it or understand the whole plan, we need to be able to have faith to take one step at a time and let God know the rest, and we will just continue to take those steps in that direction. Because at the end of the day, he does know best. Verses 11 through 12. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." The men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor-bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." And Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." And this is where, again, just like the Lord answers Jonathan's request, and he continues to take that next step of faith in the battle plan. Even throughout this, Jonathan doesn't know exactly how God is going to give them the victory, but he knows that he is going to give them the victory. And he takes that leap of faith and then begins to climb that hill, that rocky mountain that we showed earlier, to the other side, to begin to show God's power for all of Israel. Verses 13 through 14. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor-bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan and his armor-bearer, killed them after him, and that first strike with Jonathan and his armor-bearer made killed about 20 men, within as if they were half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And if we just take a moment to kind of think, where that's two people who just climbed a hill, so they're probably somewhat physically exhausted, and then they are able to kill 20 men, when those men knew that they were coming up too. It wasn't a sneak attack, it wasn't a secret. They asked them to come up. And that wouldn't have been an easy thing to do at all. And this is where we still see God's working through them, even when physically that doesn't make sense how that's possible. But they trusted God, and they knew that he was going to protect them, and that it was God's will for them to win this battle, right? And that's just another example of how God remained faithful to them throughout this story. In verse 15, and there was a panic in the camp, in the fields, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. And this is where we see how after Jonathan's and his armor bearers, those little steps of faith that we read throughout that whole story, how they first just go over to the gap in between them, and then they ask for God for directions, and then once God gives them directions, they then advance on. And this is where we see how the Lord then answers those steps of faith. And he sends the entire Philistine army into panic. And we read in verse 20 of chapter 14, that panic then caused the Philistines to strike each other with their own swords. So that now Israel isn't even fighting the battle. The Philistines are just fighting themselves. They're turning on themselves and killing their own fellow brethren. And I think there's a really good lesson in there for us, is that God can take those steps of faith that we make and can transform them into something way bigger than ever expected. Like if you start reading the story, Jonathan probably wasn't expecting that the entire army would just absolutely turn to chaos and then begin to kill each other. Now he knew the Lord was going to do something, but he probably didn't know what that was. And it really goes to show that our God is a God that is above all and controls all. And as in some of the songs that we were singing earlier, we really see that he is the highest and he is the greatest. He is the name above all other names. And I think it's a really important thing to do. And I'd just like to encourage everyone throughout the next week to just try to take some time and to remember those acts of God that he has done. Throughout the course of history, all the acts that God has done in the Bible, but also how God has remained faithful to us through our own lives. And then from that, what is our response to that? And really our response should be a heart full of gratitude, a heart that is ready to take those next steps of faith as well, because he is faithful and remains faithful until the end. And again, just coming back to that point where a lot of our faith is based on remembering God. And when we take time to reflect and see how God has worked throughout our entire lives and the entire history of mankind, we see how faithful he really has been. And just in closing too, kind of coming back to those points of taking those steps of faith. Something my brother Mark, who was playing the drums, we were kind of having talk about lives and next steps in lives. And he reminded me of a story in Joshua chapter 3. And this is when the Israelites arrive at the Jordan to cross over into the promised land in order to start to take that conquest of the promised land. And when they reach the Jordan, God asks them to cross over it just by walking through it. But what he tells them to do first is to have the priests take the Ark of the Covenant and then take it to the edge of the river and then take steps into the water. And then once they take the steps into water, he will stop the flow of water and it will create a path for them that they can walk through. And the really interesting thing there is those priests had to take that step of faith first before the water stopped. And that's something that's kind of just gone with me ever since. And it's just a beautiful example of how we need to trust God and we need to take those steps. And it may be scary at times. Like, I think if you're the priest, you're looking at like a river flowing downstream and you're like, I got to take a step into this first. Like, how do we know that it's actually going to stop, right? But that's where, again, remembering those acts that God has done, that he split the Red Sea open that they could walk through. He gave them a pillar of cloud during the day and fire at night, right? And we each have our own memories or instances where God has been faithful to us and has given us peace that surpasses all understanding, or has brought us out of dark times or troubling times. And we need to remember that and still continue to take those next steps of faith, because God can take those next steps of faith. It can multiply them more than we could ever realize. And a final verse I want to kind of close with is 2 Timothy 2:11 through 13. If we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. I think that verse is very clear about God will remain faithful. He will remain faithful to us no matter what. And we can remember that he is faithful, and we can remember those instances in our lives And we can take that with us, and throughout our lives, we can take those steps of faith because God is faithful, and that he will continue to work in our lives and through us, and that our lives may be a reflection of his glory, and we are able to live in a way that is honoring to him. Dear God, I just want to come before you, Lord, and just want to thank you for all that you have done for each person in this room, Lord. Lord, you've done so much for all of us that we probably don't even remember all the things you have done. And we probably can't even count to the amount that you have done for us, Lord. Lord, we just want to thank you for remaining faithful to us, Lord, throughout the entire course of the world, Lord, but throughout our each entire lives as well. And Lord, we just want to pray for courage to take those next steps of faith in our lives, and that we would remain focused on you, and our eyes would be centered on you and you alone, Lord. And as the waves of life come crashing against us and things seem to be bleak or slim, Lord, I just pray that you would call to our minds the acts that you have done in our lives, Lord. And Lord, that you would strengthen and encourage each of us as we go throughout the next week and the rest of our lives, Lord. And Lord, just thank you for being faithful. In Jesus' name.